I call on government orders of the day, numbers 1 to 4.
International Finance Agreements Amendment Bill, Committee Stage. Taxation, Bright Line Test for Residential Land Bill, Committee Stage. Support for Children in Hardship Bill, Committee Stage. Weathertight Homes Resolution Services Amendment Bill, Committee Stage continued.
I declare the House in committee for consideration of the International Finance Agreements Amendment Bill, the Taxation Bright Line Test for Residential Land Bill and the Support for Children in Hardship Bill, and for further consideration of Weathertight Homes Resolution Services Amendment Bill. Mr Chairman.
Mr Speaker. Mr Chairman.
G'day.
Members, the House is in committee for consideration of the International Finance Agreements Amendment Bill, the Taxation Bright Line Test for Residential Land Bill, and the Support for Children in Hardship Bill, and for further consideration of the Weathertight Homes Resolution Services Amendment Bill. We turn first to the International Finance Agreements Amendment Bill. The question is that Part 1 stand part.
Mr Chair.
I call Grant Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Chair. It's a pleasure to take a call on Part 1 of the International Finance Agreements Amendment Bill. As we discussed when the House was looking at this during the second reading, it's a bill that didn't generate an enormous amount of public interest when it came before the Select Committee. In fact, precisely no public interest when it came before the Select Committee. But that's not to say that it isn't an important piece of legislation. What I think would be useful here in Part 1 is, obviously Part 1 is the purpose clause, and the purpose of this is to allow New Zealand to participate in the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. In principle, that's something that on this side of the House we support. There is no doubt that as the Asian region continues the enormous growth that we are seeing across it, that the need for infrastructure investment, the need for investment that the international community provides only grows. And the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank arose out of the belief, and I guess you could say the concern of those in the Asian region, that the gap in infrastructure investment was too big to be bridged by those organisations who are currently working in the region. In particular, we think here of the World Bank and the IMF. That was initially the subject of some significant concern by core stakeholders within the World Bank, and there were some media reports that the United States government and others were lobbying against countries being involved in this, but we are told in the report that was provided to the Select Committee that other agencies like the World Bank have been closely cooperated with and collaborated with in developing the frameworks to allow this to exist, and importantly that they will work together with the Asian Infrastructure Bank to make sure that their projects don't cut across each other or aren't in fact working together in the best interest of the countries in the Asian region. So having got to that position, Mr Chair, it is good to acknowledge that New Zealand officials have been working alongside others to make sure that this bank has the strongest possible governance arrangements, has the best working framework to ensure the investments it makes are not only going to provide that infrastructure but also support other values that are important to New Zealanders. And it is worth noting that it was New Zealand officials who worked very hard to ensure that appointments for the board of the IIB will be open, transparent and merit-based, that there would be a non-resident board of directors, and that the appropriate environmental, social and procurement safeguards were put in place around what the bank did. That is very significant because while in principle we can say, yes, we want this infrastructure to happen, if there aren't the right safeguards around it, then we could see infrastructure investment that's less than desirable. So Annex 1 of the of the framework document lists off the draft environmental and social framework for the AIIB, and it is useful to note the environmental coverage is making sure there's an assessment around biodiversity impacts, critical habitat impacts, protected areas, climate change, the precautionary approach. All of these are really important parts of what makes for good investment, and they have been secured in this agreement, and from our point of view that is very important. We also have the social coverage, Mr Chair, which includes social risks, impacts on the community, impacts on vulnerable groups, and gender-specific impacts, an important thing to note on Equal Pay Day today, Mr Chair. It also talks about working conditions, the fact that during the implementation of operations, working conditions, health and safety, child labour, forced labour and labour relations standards all have to be taken into account when contracts are being let, or when infrastructure investment rather is being put in place under the AIIB's work. These are important safeguards, and it is very important for New Zealand's participation that those safeguards are there. So New Zealand worked hard to ensure that the governance arrangements, the safeguards were there, that there was stability. Our actual financial contribution to the bank is modest, but perhaps appropriate in terms of our relative, well, it has to be appropriate in terms of our relative GDP, because that's how it's worked out. And so we are making an initial contribution of around well, let's do US dollars because of exchange rate fluctuation, shall we? So $92 million over the next 5 years. And we've also committed US $369.2 million of callable capital. As my colleague Phil Goff noted in his interventions in the second reading, New Zealand, Mr Chair?
Grant Robertson.
Mr Chair, New Zealand has never had to call on the capital that we put aside, but that is the extent of the contribution that we've made. As I say, while that's not a significant financial contribution, it's an important stake for New Zealand to say that we are committed to this bank, we are committed to the Asian region and the opportunities that arise. The reasoning for joining the bank was threefold: economic factors. New Zealand's economic success is linked to the Asian region, and I know the leader of the Labour Party, Andrew Little, was in China last week, as other ministers from the other side of the House have visited regularly as well. No one can underestimate the extent of the development that is there, the extent of how our China is continuing to invest. The Prime Minister will go with a business delegation to Vietnam next week. There is a country where there is a need for increased infrastructure investment for them to continue to develop sustainably. Enormous rates of growth, but a country that could do that. We've just seen the elections this weekend in Myanmar. There is a country with an enormous infrastructure deficit that could be assisted by the work of this bank. From New Zealand's point of view, all of those are countries with whom we will trade and do trade, and all of those are countries that we want to see flourish in order for our region to flourish. The second reason was around connectivity to market and our ability to build on the connections that we already have in Asia. We have status within ASEAN. We attend the East Asia Summit. That's where the Prime Minister is going next week, and obviously we have the free trade agreements with China and other ASEAN members. This is a further step in New Zealand staying connected in the Asian region and connected to where we will see much of our future trade relationships. And then there's just the question of the ability to influence. If New Zealand's not there in a discussion like this, we don't have the ability to do the very things I mentioned before, of making sure that the governance arrangements are sound and that the bank is working with the systems that we would want. So, Mr Chair, I'll leave my contribution there. Suffice to say that the Labour Party supports this bill. In part, in this part one of the bill, there is no particular changes to deal with. In part two, there is one which I will take a brief call on.